It's, a hallmark of beer. And if you don't have that nice frothy foam, then it's just not beer. I think in some cases, it's really nice to have that, even in styles where it's hard to get foam, like a hazy IPA or something like that. It's important. Like we do drink with our eyes. How the beer looks, how the beer presents, is really important, and that does extend to consumers. I think beer consumers tend to gravitate towards beer with nice foam. That really, really creamy foam on a nitro stout like Guinness. It can be, a big fluffy meringue on a saison or a lager. I think it looks nice. I think a lot of people agree. Maybe that's not true in some places, but I think it's true in a lot of places. So what are we actually going to talk about here? We're going to talk about how beer foam is formed, and we're going to get into a little bit of the science there. I'll be the first to admit I am not the expert in beer foam science. If you do want to check out more, there's this amazing book that I've shown here from Charlie Bamforth, the Pope of Foam. That's his real nickname. UC Davis professor of brewing, now retired. But he's the foam guy. You can check out some YouTube videos of him talking about foam. There's even this amazing documentary I saw where it's like him in a dimly lit room with like a glass of beer, basically just spitting poetry about foam. He's the guy. I'm not. Just want to put that out there. If you want to learn more, you can check out the book that he put out. But here we are going to talk and educate on what contributes to foam. We're going to talk about the general best practices for beer foam. We're going to talk about how fermentation and yeast impacts beer foam and head retention. We're also going to talk about just some of the other factors that impact foam, as well as how to whip the meringue, how to make that fluffy head, maximize foam quality and head retention in your beer. If that is your goal, we're going to help you get there. So let's start with the science. There will be science. There will be a lot of scientific graphs. I'm going to do my best to break them down. So what is beer foam? Besides looking awesome, that's one of the most famous, I would say, foam positive beers out there is the Bierstadt slow pour pills, where, it's right in the name. They pour it slow so it gets this nice, beautiful, stable foam. Beer foam, at the end of the day, at its most basic, is a mixture of gas, protein, and liquid. So how does this work? We have CO2, the bubbles that are inside a beer. And then we also, inside the beer, in the liquid, we have some protein coming typically from our grains. So what happens here is when you dispense beer, and it's usually from a pressurized container, like a bottle or a can or a keg, foam is produced. And that's produced because CO2 comes out of solution because of that pressure reduction between the vessel it came from and where it's going into, which typically is a glass, right? Like a glass where we're at atmospheric pressure. It's lower pressure environment. So CO2 comes out of solution. That CO2 creating bubbles and the protein inside that beer helping to stabilize those bubbles is what creates beer foam. So we have two main properties when we look at the foam in a beer. We have the formation of foam, and we also have the retention of foam. So these are two different factors. They're both important to determining the head retention or foam retention of a beer. And what's important here is that proteins in our beer will stabilize that liquid and gas interface. So that interface between the liquid beer and the gas bubble is stabilized by proteins that come from our beer. That's why, carbonated water doesn't hold a head. It doesn't have any protein. It can't do that, whereas beer can. Or things like cider, for example. Sparkling wine, we have to do crazy stuff for it to have foam like champagne. We're lucky in beer, we've got protein, so we can lean on that. But there's other factors too, like hop acids, that also matter. So how is foam formed? There's a few major factors that influence how much foam gets formed. For the homebrewers out there, if you accidentally bottle your beer too soon, or you get a diastaticus infection, you know that it's possible to create a lot of foam if the beer is overcarbonated. And that's because more CO2 in solution means more CO2 will come out of solution when that beer is depressurized. So whether that's in a keg or a bottle, if you've got a really highly carbonated beer, you've got more CO2 that's going to fight to come out of solution, which means that your beer is going to have more foam capacity. So something that's overcarbonated, whether that's intentional or not, is going to have more capacity for foam production. And then when you pour a beer, you tend to have it happen in a few phases. When you first pour that beer, you'll see it separated into two phases. You know this. You know you've got your foam and you've got your liquid phase or your beer. And when that beer is poured and that foam is formed, it'll start as what's called a wet foam, meaning that it still has a lot of liquid in it. That liquid will drain down through the bubbles back into the liquid phase of the beer. So you'll actually see what's called a foam collapse and the formation of what's called a dry foam, that being a more stable foam that is higher in proteins, for example, and hop oils than just in liquid beer, because those are the things that are making the stable foam, right? A wet foam is typically not going to be very stable. There's ways to sort of hack that. So if you look at nitrogen dosing, for example, that changes the size of the bubbles, so it makes it possible to have a more stable wet foam. So something like Guinness, that would be an example. And then after a foam's been formed, the foam collapses. It's inevitable. There's never, a beer foam that lasts forever. So after you pour, the foam collapse will begin. You do get, if you've done every step to get a good stable foam, good stable head on the beer, you will see that stable foam for a little while, and you will also see that eventually collapse. So that rate of collapse is dependent on the stability of the foam. Basically what happens here is those actual bubbles will burst and they'll get absorbed back into the liquid phase. So even the proteins and things like that, if the easiest path for them to go is to go back into the liquid phase, that's what they're going to do, unless it's on the side of the glass, in which case it'll kind of dry out on the side of the glass. And that's what we call lacing. That's basically controlled foam collapse adhering to the side of the glass, which can also look quite nice. You can influence this. So you can pour beer to get a more stable foam. The classic way to do it is to pour the beer vigorously. Basically, you don't want to overfill your glass, but you want it to go near the top with foam, and then wait. Let that foam settle. Basically, let that wet foam collapse into dry foam. Then you can wait about 30 seconds and then pour more beer. And basically what's going to happen is you're going to put more beer underneath that stable foam. It's going to rise up, form more foam, and that's how you get that beautiful foam that rises above the lip of the glass. If that's what you're looking for, that's how you do it. Some might call that whipping the meringue. Check out our Facebook group, Whip the Meringue, if you're interested in pictures of, basically exclusively pictures of beer foam. Or slow pour is another concept. Basically, like you pour a beer slowly in multiple phases, you're going to promote stable foam at the end of the day. So there's ways that you can influence this besides what's even in the beer, just how you pour it, because of the physics of the foam. So how do we measure it? There are tools. There are fancy analytical tools that you can use, and it is important for quality assurance. Foam is an important factor in beer. All other factors being equal, and there's actually sensory studies that have been done on this. People will prefer and rank beer that has persistent foam higher. So it's actually really, really important. You can get some misleading results if you're trying to figure out if customers or consumers like a beer better if the foam's different between two beers, even though you're actually testing the yeast strain or something else. So in general, most people prefer beer with foam, except for maybe the Brits. I know that they like their beer poured to the top, so that's a little bit of a difference. However, you can also measure foam with your eyes. It's a pretty easy thing to measure with your eyes if you don't need an exact number. And there are even methods that use cameras where you're still measuring basically optically the foam collapse, but you can use a camera to get a numerical measure of foam collapse if you're looking to introduce that into quality assurance in a brewery. So what influences beer foam? As I sort of buried the lead on this, but grain is one of our biggest factors. So proteins that come from the grain, in beer, we're mostly brewing with barley. Proteins that come from the grain will impact the beer foam typically positively. So that's what we're seeing in the graph on the right-hand side. There is a correlation there between the protein concentration in the beer and the foam stability. Now, it's not perfectly linear because it's beer, it's complex, there's other stuff going on, but there is a correlation there. So generally more protein means more foam stability. The main components of foam stability coming from your grain are proteins called LTP1, or lipid transfer protein 1, and protein Z, of which there's actually a few, like Z4, Z7, or Z for those of us using the Queen's English. So LTP1 will aid foam formation. So that actual formation of the foam in the glass, that protein basically helps in forming those bubbles. And what's important here is that the boiling step in making your wort actually impacts foam formation. So LTP1 is denatured by boiling, like most proteins. But what's kind of interesting here is that the denatured form of LTP1 is what improves the foaming property. So for those of you out there making raw ales, like beers that are not boiled, you might see worse foam, and this might be why. Whereas beers that have a boil, like most conventional modern beers, this protein is denatured, so you'll get the full foaming potential. Protein Z, or Z, is what aids foam stability. So if you've got lots of LTP1 there helping you to form the foam, the protein Zs are basically what help stabilize that interface between the gas and the liquid, and those will aid the foam stability. And those also come from your grain. Now, it's not necessarily that simple. As you've seen, beers tend to have all sorts of diversity of different foam types. So the balance between the proteins and the other factors can determine the type of foam in your beer. And it goes a little bit deeper. So different grain varieties, types, and processing methods can impact the foam potential as well. So if you look, for example, at wheat versus barley, wheat tends to be more foam positive than barley. So a lot of brewers, if they're making a saison or a wheat beer, or even some brewers making lagers, they might introduce a little bit of wheat into the recipe to improve the foam stability. That's even true for things like hazy IPAs, for example. Wheat tends to outperform barley in terms of foam stability. Crystal or caramel malts tend to actually be foam negative. They have lower foam stability than your base malt. And then what's actually interesting here, and I don't think that everyone knows this, is that roasted malts have really good foam stability. And that doesn't have as much to do with protein as it does with some of the other things found in them. So some of the products of roasting, like melanoidins and polyphenols, basically the byproducts of heating that grain and roasting it, those can also be very foam positive. So you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, the most foam positive grains are those roasted grains, your black patent and your roasted barley. So if you're wondering, like, how do I get great foam stability in a stout? Well, make sure that your roasted barley's in there. It actually is impacting it. So it doesn't help you if you're trying to make a pale beer and improve foam, but it can be very, very useful in dark beers. And then something to keep in mind here also is that even in the base malt, assuming barley, the processing will change the foam. So less kilning, for example. So like a Pilsner will typically have more potential for foam versus like a Vienna or a Munich. And you can see that, especially with the Munich here on the right-hand side in the graph, that having lower foam potential than our, in this case, the two row that's there in the third bar. So that's real data. And then barley variety can also impact this. So this is, where things get a little bit hairy because, if you're a brewer, you're buying malt, the barley varieties are changing all the time based on, what makes sense to the farmers, what makes sense in terms of what's been developed with new barley varieties. If you watched our webinar on how we make new yeast strains, we talked about, a lot of the barley varieties that are being used are completely different than the ones that were being used 30 or 40 years ago. And in fact, this research from 1999, I don't really know if any of these barley varieties are in use anymore. They've mostly been phased out. So that's constantly changing. And something to keep in mind is that you will have different foam potential from different barley varieties. Crop year and like the conditions of growing where the barley is grown and the climate can also impact the concentration of foam forming proteins. So it's always a moving target is the take home here, right? If you can't control exactly what barley variety is being grown and where it's being grown, you've always got a bit of a moving target with foam, and that can have big impacts, right? Like here you can see this is just in concentration of LTP1, but you can see about a 60% difference between 30 to 60%, 30 to 40% difference between barley varieties. So it can be significant, right? So if you're troubleshooting a foam issue, you may want to talk to your malt supplier and see if the actual variety of barley has changed, because it will change from year to year. Another thing to note here, because in this study they actually did test raw grain, green malt, as well as kilned malt. So basically the raw grain pre-malting, the green malt before it's kilned, and the kilned malt, so basically after heating it. And one also thing to note here is that less kilning on the base malt will usually also mean better foam potential because of a higher concentration of that LTP1. So that's to the point about typically less kiln malts like a Pilsner malt is going to have more foam potential than something that's more heavily kilned like a Vienna. And moving on from the grain, grain is really, really important, but so is basically every other ingredient in your beer. So hops also have an impact on beer foam. The hop isoalpha acids, so those bitter acids, have a positive impact on foam. So all other things considered equal, what we can see in the graph on the right is that as the bitterness units go higher, so does the stability of the foam. In this case, we're looking at a few different factors in foam stability. So all other things considered equal, beers with higher hopping rates will have better foam stability. And there's even specialized extracts out there that are light stable and foam positive that you can use to improve the foam of the beer. And these work really, really well. So products like tetra-iso extract or hexa-iso extract, those are very specific conformations of isoalpha acid that you can get as liquid concentrates. Probably not in the homebrew world yet, but certainly on the professional side. You can use these to adjust your bittering. You can adjust foam stability. They work really, really well, especially the hexa-iso. Just adding, 5 IBUs of hexa-iso can really, really help with foam quality in a beer. So that's a hot tip here for sure. But it does get complicated. So the isoalpha acids are positive on foam, and some of the other hop acids are as well. But dry hopping, so adding hops to the beer, either mid-ferment or post-ferment, can be foam positive or negative. It can also be varietal and dose specific. So there is some data out there showing, Cascade hops can be foam positive at lower rates, but foam negative at higher rates. So I'm not sure exactly why, but, achieving really good foam on a hazy IPA is not always the easiest task. And that's why sometimes, even if you're building in a lot of protein, you might also be building in a lot of things that might be foam negative coming from those hops. Like there is a lot of oil and polyphenol and stuff like that that might not necessarily be foam positive. And we're still trying to understand that. And then moving on beyond our hops, we also have yeast. So every ingredient matters to foam. If that's the only thing you take home from this, then I've done my job. And yeast actually does impact beer foam as well in 2 ways. So yeast can break down proteins, and obviously that can impact the foam because if yeast breaks down proteins, then you have less proteins to make foam. And yeast can also actually contribute proteins that stabilize foam as well. And we're going to get into that because I think it's kind of cool. So in terms of protein breakdown, stressed yeast will secrete what's called protease enzymes that break down proteins. And that can include the foam proteins in the beer. So the image you're seeing on the right is literally beer foam proteins being broken down by yeast protease. So in this study, they tested yeast protease against the foaming proteins in beer. And you can actually see in that third lane, those proteins are degrading, right? You have a much stronger band concentration of protein Z and LTP1, and they're getting decreased by that yeast protease. So in some ways, breaking down proteins in the beer can be a good thing. Like a little bit of yeast protease activity can actually help you clarify the beer. Some proteins are kind of hard to remove through fining or filtration. So it can be helpful, or it can be bad, right? If you have too much protease activity by the yeast, you will lose head retention because the yeast will break down those head-forming proteins. So if you're having head retention issues, yeast health is a really obvious place to look, a really important place to look. One of the major consequences of yeast being stressed, especially if it's repitched, is degrading foam quality. So if you're making beers and your foam quality is varying from batch to batch, One place that you should, and your malt's the same, your hops are the same, the place you should be looking is your yeast, because your yeast might be getting a variable level of stress and therefore doing a variable amount of protein breakdown, which will impact your foam and make it inconsistent. So here's just an example. You can see the differences basically in this case between a yeast with the ability to protect foam and without. So strain selection, even outside of just stress resistance, strain selection of the yeast impacts foam quality. And the reason for that is that yeast actually have foaming genes. They have genes that are associated with the formation and retention of foam. Just like how barley has the LTP1 and the protein Z, yeast actually has a foaming gene as well, or foaming genes. So there's a number of different genes or proteins in the yeast that kind of match this profile. But the ones that we know about so far, we call it CFG1 in lager yeast, or Carlsbergensis foaming gene, because that's what we called lager yeast at the time. We changed the name of it, or AWA1, which I think awa is the Japanese word for foam, and this was originally identified because sake brewers were having issues with foaming, and they didn't want to have to deal with it. So the people who developed sake yeast found a way to get rid of this gene, and all of a sudden the sake brewers could fill their tanks to the brim and get more efficiency. So you can see the impact of that. In this case, it's from a study. It's a really cool study where they found this foaming gene in lager yeast, and they took that lager yeast and they actually took that foaming gene out, and you can see the difference in the beers on the right-hand side. A yeast with the foaming gene had a more stable foam than a yeast that didn't have the foaming gene. Bubbles. Thanks, Jeff. Bubbles is the Japanese word. And the reason for this is that those genes are hydrophobic proteins. They are manoproteins, which are often, there's all sorts of different, what's called manoproteins, which are basically mano being mannose, like the sugar, and proteins. So you have like a protein and a sugar stuck together. And a lot of these end up on the outside of the yeast cell and help that yeast cell interact with its environment. So you have other manoproteins that might, for example, help the yeast cells adhere to each other, for example. And that's because in all these cases, those manoproteins, at least for these ones, CFG1, AWA1, they're hydrophobic. So they will impact the actual cell surface of that yeast and influence how it responds to its environment. And these also, because biology is imperfect, these manoproteins will shear off the cell as it's circulating around your fermentation, and some of it will go into the beer and continue to impact the foaming ability of your beer. And that's just because you have these hydrophobic proteins, these hydrophobic particles, say that 5 times, that help to stabilize the foam. So you can see again that difference. The yeast that has the CFG1, the foaming gene, has much higher hydrophobicity on the cell surface versus the yeast that has that gene removed. So that's a clear example. And the downstream ramification is that impact on foam quality. If you're getting more of that manoprotein into the beer, it seems to be associated with more stable foam. And here's just another illustration. You can take that gene and delete it, and you will have less stable foam in the beer in this lager strain. So you might ask, which yeasts have the foam gene? And we actually went and looked, and we haven't done a whole lot of sharing of this data. It is older data, but it was a fun, quick little study. So we actually went and looked because we thought, okay, we know that this is known in lager strains. We also know that this other gene has been found in sake yeasts, which surprisingly are like not that far removed from brewing yeast. They have some genetic similarities. So let's go and look at our strains and see which ones have foaming genes. So CFG1 and AWA1 are slightly different from each other, but they are known to have similar properties of promoting foaming both in fermentation and in the service of the beverage, pouring a beer. So what we found is that all of our commercial lager strains do have CFG1. We did find some lager strains from other suppliers that don't have it. So it's not a universal rule. Some lager strains don't seem to have this gene. We also found some of the Belgian strains have it. So most of the your British or American strains don't seem to have this gene in them, at least by the PCR method that we used. And this is probably why if you make a hazy IPA with an English strain, you might not get the greatest foam. But some of the saisons do. So French saison is an example. Does have a gene protein that looks like AWA1. And so does the wit beer strains. So if you've ever tried propagating or like making a starter of a wit beer strain, you'll probably notice that it's super foamy. And this is why. This is probably why. They're pretty fast growing and they've got this gene. So you're going to get a lot of foam whipped up. So classic wit, fruity wit, those are both examples of strains that seem to have AWA1 in them. So what does that do for the yeast? Number one, it does mean a foamier propagation and fermentation. I know for us, from our own experience, the saisons and the wits are foamy little buggers, and we often have to underfill our tanks or use more anti-foam to be able to, not just have yeast blowing off out of the tank. And that's true in fermentation as well. One of the benefits with lager yeast fermenting cold is that you don't have as much of an issue. So, even though the yeasts are like technically bottom fermenting, if you ferment lager warm, you can actually get a lot of foam, and that's probably because of this. So, that's another plus for colder ferments of lagers is that you don't have as much foaming to worry about, and you can keep more of that foaming protein in the beer. And the downstream result of this is that you can get better head retention. So it's really no surprise that lagers and saisons are often the beers that have the best foam, and this is kind of why. Also, like just the general recipe processes as well, but yeast does play a role. If you're to make the same beer with a California ale versus a lager strain, you're probably going to get better foam from the lager strain. So that's a hot tip for all the cold IPA brewers out there as well. And even beyond just yeast selection, there's other properties that can impact foam. So I know bottle conditioning is pretty niche at this point. It's not so common, but it is a method used to carbonate beer. And what's important here is that bottle conditioning is usually foam positive. And so what's going on here is that you're getting release of yeast manoproteins or polysaccharides, foam positive things, when the yeast dies and goes through the autolysis process. So yeast dies. Yeast guts and cell walls have some stuff on them that gets released, and that is often foam positive, especially if it's done in a controlled manner. So this is studied way better in sparkling wine, because in sparkling wine, they don't have the protein in the wine. Like if you get a champagne, a really nice champagne, you pour it, it actually has a pretty persistent foam. It'll be stable for, a little while, and you have no protein coming from the wine, coming from the grapes. It's all it's all dead yeast basically making that stable foam in one of the most expensive beverages in the world. So that's a fun fact. Next time someone's opening a bottle of bubbly, let them know that dead yeast helped make it happen. Really well studied in sparkling wine because some of those products are so expensive and valuable, like champagne. A lot of science has been done on optimizing that process. And something I'll highlight here when we're talking about beer is that temperature plays a role. So a cold storage temperature is typically going to be better long term. If you've experienced the typical flavors of yeast autolysis, like the rubbery, kind of cheesy flavors, that's usually yeast autolysis that happens in an uncontrolled manner at too high a temperature. If you've got a bottle of beer, it's got a small amount of yeast in it, like you should be not putting a ton of yeast into beer when it's bottle conditioned. And once that carbonation has been achieved, like once that fermentation in the bottle has been achieved, that beer is then stored at a cool temperature, like under 20 Celsius. You'll be able to get like a control of this process. And that often then means that you get better foam, and you also can even change the properties of the beer. So if you're looking for smaller bubbles, for example, in your beer or in your bottle conditioned beer, the stuff that comes out of the yeast when it dies will actually even impact the size of the bubbles. So if you get, again, like really nice champagne has tiny bubbles, and that's because of yeast sacrificing itself to the beverage. And the same thing happens in beer. Like you can get some really nice aged bottle conditioned beers, and the size of the bubbles will be different in those, and that changes the foam, changes the texture of the beer, it changes a lot about the experience. And that's all to do with basically controlled yeast cell death. I did my thesis on this topic, so I hope I come across as passionate. So, in summary, what's bad for foam? Over modified base malt is not going to be beneficial for your foam. Something we didn't talk about, but we should, is also the influence of trub. Trub is rich in fatty acids, which, as you know, fats can be foam negative. You know, if you're boiling a pot of pasta, you know you can put a few drops of olive oil in, and that'll help keep that foam down. It's the same thing, right? Too much fatty acids will negatively impact foam. Same thing, you know, you have beer with beautiful foam and you've got a little bit of grease on your lips. You drink that beer, the head's gone. That's what's going on here. So you've got to be careful about fatty acids. A beer with a protein rest for too long, you're starting the process of breaking down the proteins. And then if you also then get some yeast protease activity, you can break them down too much. You can lose your LTP1 and protein Z, and you're just not going to get a stable foam. And so yeast health also impacts this here. Bad yeast health is going to ultimately release protease from the yeast and cause it to break down some of the foam. So you don't want a low viability yeast. You want to make sure that your yeast is really healthy. It's hitting the same numbers in terms of cell count and viability if you are repitching. And then maybe obvious, but dirty glassware, that's always going to just look bad and not be good for your foam. So what's good for your foam? And I got some pictures here. These are from the Whip the Meringue Facebook group. Check it out. Typically shorter mash times and rests, and actually hotter mash rests, because you're basically getting less protease activity. If you don't need the protease activity, like you've got a decently well modified malt, controlling the enzyme activity will typically give you better foam. Higher protein content, so using things like wheat malt, flaked barley, again, because malting and kilning might reduce that protein content a little bit. Those can also positively impact your foam. As we talked about, roasted grain is awesome for foam stability, as is making sure, on the other hand, making sure your wort is clear. So getting the trub out of there. It's a balancing act because trub is really good for yeast health, but it's not necessarily good for foam. So you want to establish like what is a good level of trub in the wort for this yeast strain and this beer, and try to stick to it and make it consistent. That being said, you've got ways you can compensate, right? If you knock out all the trub, you just, one thing to make sure is that you're putting a yeast nutrient in there, making sure that the yeast is getting zinc, all that good stuff. Higher hopping rates, specifically higher bittering rates, will give you better foam. Dry hopping can help. It can be good. It can be bad. All depends on the rate and the varieties, and there's still not a whole lot of clarity there. Bottle conditioning will help with foam, both in terms of producing more foam-producing proteins, polysaccharides, and also just changing even the size of those bubbles over time. Clean glassware is essential for good foam. And then there's things like nitrogen in the dispense. So if you're doing a beer gas or nitrogen dispense of the beer, like a Guinness, that will change the size of the bubbles also. It'll also change the solubility of the gas, which will give it a different appearance and a different texture in the foam. So how do we design a beer for head retention? And I thought I would come correct and show a beer that I made that had pretty excellent foam retention, I would say. So that's actually being topped up, and that's a beer that would keep that foam above the edge of the glass. So this is just an example of what we could do. We could call this like a hybrid Hellas American lager, maybe. It would probably be pretty good. So we could make a beer with North American Pilsner malt. North American malts, all other things considered equal, tend to have higher protein content than European malts do. Tend to have higher protein. Also tend to be modified to have higher fans, so that can be quite nice for the yeast as well. No knock against the European malts, but and some can also deliver really, really good foam as well. So I haven't personally found that like European malts are better than North American malts. There are specific varieties or brands that I find work really well and some don't. So, you do have to experiment. And then what did I throw in here? Flaked wheat, because that's going to give you some protein as well to work with. You do a step mash with short steps. I really like step mashing for lagers and saisons personally, but it's all personal preference. In this case, if we want to maximize foam, we can favor the alpha rest. So like practically what I would do is probably just do a step mash. If we're doing a single infusion, we'd probably go around. We could go around 70 Celsius. If we're doing a step, we could go 63, hit the beta and a bit of protein, bring it up to 72. So just do the 63 real quick, like 20, 30 minutes, bring it up to 72, rest it for 45 minutes to an hour, bring it up to mash out and keep going. That would work pretty well, I think, in terms of promoting foam. We'd give that beer pretty high IBU, make sure it gets lots of bittering hops. Just make sure the recipe is designed so that it's not overly bitter when we taste it. Get lots of flavor from the hops. Maybe I'll use something like Tettnang. Cool fermentation, again, just to help retain some of those proteins. At least like coming off a lager yeast that's a theory, but I think that can work pretty well. And the other reason for the cool fermentation is that we can naturally carbonate. I don't have data on this, but I do find from experience that tends to help with foam quality. And maybe it's because we're getting some extra stuff coming off the yeast. The pressure is a little bit stressful to the yeast. But spunding is an awesome technique with lagers in general. Help preserve some aromatics and retain some carbonation, save money on CO2. Just as long as the yeast isn't stressed out. If the yeast is stressed out and throwing off flavors, you're just going to concentrate them by spunding. So you do have to make sure that the yeast is happy and healthy. And then we want to harvest the yeast as soon as we hit final gravity and pass our diacetyl test. We want most of the yeast out of there. It's okay to leave a little bit of yeast in for cold conditioning or lagering, but you don't want a ton in there because it's just going to start dying. It's just going to start getting stressed out and releasing protease, and it's going to impact the foam quality negatively. So I know at the industrial scale, a lot of the big brewers will target a certain amount of yeast, usually 500,000 to 1 million cells per mil, going into the lagering tank. So that is like some yeast, but it's like that would be not that hazy. Like it would be, let's call it Keller beer level of haze, not like hazy IPA level of haze. Going into the lagering tank is usually the target. And then lagering can help as well. You're just like cold conditioning the beer. That can certainly help just stabilize the beer in general. So that would be an example. You go the totally other direction and ferment, pretty quick with the saison yeast warm, and then let it settle out cold, and then bottle condition that beer. It would work very well. And you're adding other foam positive things like saison yeast. You're adding bottle conditioning. So there's lots of different ways to achieve that. A stout with the roasted barley is also going to be very foam positive. So I don't know if anyone's been making stouts with lager yeast, but try it out because I bet it would work pretty well. So there's an example. Okay, it would not be one of these webinars without a quick product plug, because I think if you're looking to improve your foam, there are some solutions out there. Because poor yeast health will lead to bad foam. Than and zinc content tend to have the biggest impact. Some of the micronutrients can also impact the yeast. If some of those micronutrients, B vitamins, minerals are missing, the yeast is going to have to do extra work, and that might include secreting protease and breaking down your head. So having the right amount of nutrition in your wort will help make sure that the yeast, when it's at the end of that ferment, it's healthy. It doesn't go scavenging for amino acids and secreting protease and breaking down your foam. You don't want that. So some brewers have noticed improvement in their foam quality when they do make nutrient adjustments and make sure that they're getting the right amount of nutrients into the fermenter. And there's lots of solutions out there. I really like our yeast lightning. It seems to be helping a lot of people. And then another thing to consider in terms of nutrition is that wort oxygenation can also matter. If you don't get enough wort oxygenation for the yeast strain you're using, that can also be a root cause of poor foam, because again, you got less yeast cells growing, less yeast cells doing the same amount of work. So, they're stretched a little bit more thin. That can cause some issues with foam quality towards the end, right? Because those yeasts are kind of tired towards the end of the fermentation. If they need more resources in order to keep going, they're going to start scavenging protein and, again, secrete the protease, break down that protein, you get less foam. And same goes for strain selection. So we did learn today, some yeast strains have this foaming gene. Still lots of work to be done on figuring this out, because there's a lot of similar proteins out there in the yeast, and there's a lot of confusing information. So there's still a lot of work to be done on, on our end, on the research side. But yeast strain selection matters. And something to keep in mind is like if you are looking to get the best possible foam in your lager, um, keep in mind that some commercial lager strains don't have that foaming gene. We did find some that don't. Although in our own strain lineup, all the current lager strains that we have on offer, including the recently launched Lost Lager, do have this gene. So you don't have to worry about that. They will help with promoting foam. And if you like looking at pictures of beautiful foamy beers, check out Whip the Meringue on Facebook. I don't really remember how this happened, but this is a Facebook group that I am an administrator of. And it's one of my favorite places on the internet. It's just people posting pictures of beautiful beers with nice foam. So check that out. It's an awesome time. Most of Facebook is a cesspool. Whip the Meringue is great. Stay foam positive. And learn more. Don't just brew, craft. We do have lots of resources that I want to highlight. So we're going to be throwing this webinar up on YouTube. We'll keep adding to that content there. You can always check out our knowledge base. There's lots of information there. If you actually want to look and see, for example, what oxygen levels your strain of yeast needs, you can look that up there. So you can dial that in. And the blog as well. So a lot of this webinar was based on an old blog post that we did on foam. I just thought it would be useful to expand it with some nice pictures and some new insights as well. So don't sleep on the blog. Lots of information on there to help you be a better brewer. And if you're still looking for more information, we have 3 more webinars coming up. So we're officially halfway through our fall webinar series, although if it's officially fall. It's officially fall until December 21st, but it's also officially snowing outside here in Canada, so it does not feel like fall. It feels like winter. However, we're halfway through. We've covered what's in a strain, yeast versus hop creep, and stay foam positive. In 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about controlling beer haze. So 2 topics: how do we keep our clear beers clear, and how do we keep our hazy beers hazy? And I'm going to take our crack at this problem because I think it's an issue and a problem for a lot of brewers. I've heard this from a few that, my hazies are clear and my lagers are hazy. What's going on? So we're going to try to break it down and give you some help there, so that you don't have to worry about that. And then there's an ulterior motive here. We're going to wrap a lot of this stuff that we've been talking about in this series up in a talk that we call the Modern IPA. So putting a lot of these pieces together into, what's going on with the IPA, because it's not really just East Coast, West Coast anymore. It's really changed. And what tools and information is available to us to design a modern IPA. So we're gonna be doing that in December. And then as a bonus on Boxing Day, yes, in Canada we call the day after Christmas Boxing Day. I don't know if that's true in other places. We're gonna have a bonus video for you on crispy lagers. So if you are really looking at dialing in your lager production next year, you got to make sure to check that one out. That's going to come from Nate Ferguson. I've seen an early version of this. Really, really should help you understand, how do I make a lager, or how do I improve my lagers? There's a lot of mystery out there, and we're going to try to break it down and help you out. So that's it. I'll leave this QR code up. If you want to scan that takes you right to our website. You can find additional resources to educate yourself, and I'll be sticking around to answer some questions as well. Thank you. So we got some questions already, and there's some good ones that are going to challenge me, so I appreciate that. So starting with Frank, he says, how does less kilning equals better foam versus roasted malts equals better foam go together? From what I can tell, and I do need to dig into this a little bit more, it's a bit of like a no man's land in between, where the less kilning means that you're not breaking down those proteins as much. And in the middle, if you look at those like Vienna and then like some of the crystal caramel malts, it seems like you are, thermally breaking down those proteins, including those foam forming proteins. Like you can even think of a caramel malt. Like what is it? You're basically cooking sugar and protein and forming Maillard reactions. So you're losing your LTP1 and other things to the Maillard reactions. But the roasted ones, that's where you have actually other things that are coming in. So I talked about polyphenols, for example, being foam positive. So, literally the byproducts of getting that malt to the point where it's roasting can then bring it back to being foam positive. So it all just comes down to like what happens when that grain is thermally processed. And so, as I understand it, you have a certain baseline level of these foam forming proteins, and then if it's cooked more, you're losing them to things like Maillard reactions. But then if you're roasting, for example, you're getting some byproducts that are actually become foam positive. That's my crack at that. Brandon asks, where does rye sit on the foam stability chart? What about gluten-free grains? I don't have some data at hand, so correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But I would assume that rye is probably pretty low on the foam stability because it is low in protein. Like compared to wheat and barley, rye tends to be a lot lower in protein. It doesn't have the same proteins either. So that could also influence it. That being said, rye is freaky in a lot of ways. In bread baking, for example, it doesn't have as much protein, so it's harder to make a dough, but it has what's called pentosands, which are different types of sugars, the different types of like polysaccharides. And that influences like its ability to form a dough. And it gets the job done in a completely different way. So that might be the case in beer. Like you will get some of those gums and pentosands from the rye into the beer. Like rye can change the texture of beer a lot for that reason. As to how that impacts foam, I'm not sure. And then you also asked about gluten-free grains. It probably depends on the grains. At the end of the day, you'd have to look and see, how much protein, what type of proteins are in these grains, and then also, are there any foam negative properties of the grains? So some might have higher fatty acid content. So oats is a great example of a gluten-free grain that would be foam negative because oats are high in fatty acids. So a hazy IPA with a lot of oats is probably not going to have as much foam stability. There are ways around it. Like you look at an oatmeal stout, you have roasted malt, which is foam positive, and flaked oats, which is probably foam negative. They can balance each other out, right? You've got some ability to play around that way. Other ones, I'm not sure. Like we've done some experimentation with millet and sorghum, and they produced foam. So that's my answer there. Great question, Brandon. Thank you. So Jacob asks, how do hops such as variety and timing affect foam? So yeah, we did cover this a little bit, but I can dive into it a little bit more because it is important. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to. There's like one study that I know exists, and I was not able to find it. I saw it at a conference, so it probably just exists as some grad student's poster, but it was super useful. So I'm going to try to find it. But hop variety does impact foam. I know I've seen this study. I don't think I hallucinated it, but I haven't been able to track that down yet through the power of Google. So I'm going to have to dig into some of the conference archives. I think it was like a Master Brewers or something like that. But hop variety does seem to impact foam. This was looking specifically at dry hopping, if I remember, but some hops are foam positive, some hops are foam negative. And it seemed to come down to some aspect of the oil composition of the hops. Timing affects foam a lot. So, basically the more you isomerize the alpha acid, so the earlier the hops are added, typically in the boil, the more foam positive that addition will be. And there might be some balances there too. So like another thing to keep in mind when we get into dry hopping is that dry hopping is known to actually strip out alpha. So other compounds in the dry hops, like humulinones, will actually like replace the alpha with themselves. So in a dry hop beer, you can actually drop out alpha acid and increase the humulinones. So in that case, that's another way that dry hopping can be foam negative, especially if it's like heavily dry hopped, like a hazy IPA. Okay, I promise this one's not a advertisement or a plant. Merlinus asks, how do we as homebrewers get our hands on yeast lightning, and can you use liquid zinc sulfate by itself? So the answer is you should be able to get yeast lightning from your local homebrew shop. If you can't, you should ask them to stock our products. You can also pick it up from our website. You should be able to get your hands on it. It is shelf stable for a long time. The 28-gram homebrew pack will last you a long time. I will often overdo it just like when I'm home brewing, just because like it's like literally like half a teaspoon. So I'll just put a teaspoon in. Works very, very well, I would say. Can you use liquid zinc sulfate by itself? Absolutely. Like that's if you're looking at, there's kind of two camps with brewers. There's like those that use nutrient and those that insist on only zinc, and neither is right. I think my preferred is a middle ground where you're using a nutrient that covers all of those bases of like what could be missing from the malt, and also making sure that there's actually zinc going into the beer, because depending on how you add zinc, it might not actually get into the wort and be available to the yeast. So that's really important. So I love the suggestion of liquid zinc sulfate, because that's kind of the way to go if you're going to do just zinc. Adding it to the fermenter rather than to the kettle. So you can make like a sterile zinc solution, basically boil up some zinc in a mason jar, for example, and you got to do some calculations, but basically just adding like a couple, well, in the case of a homebrew batch, like probably just like a couple drops of that will get you where you need to be in terms of zinc. There's other solutions out there too. We'll be releasing an updated version of Yeast Lightning soon as well, where we've been trying to build in more soluble zinc as well. So there's a lot of options out there. Alrighty, so that's it for the questions. I think we will wrap this up. I want to say thank you for attending live. If you're here live, if you're watching on YouTube, also thank you for making it this far. Make sure to do all the good stuff like liking and subscribing and checking out our other videos, telling your friends. It actually does make a difference. It's great to hear from customers when they're watching our videos. It's good to know that we're having an impact. So if any of these videos are helpful to you, make sure you let us know. Helps us inspire to keep going. And if you've got ideas for more stuff that you want to learn from us, also let us know, because we do take your feedback to design these webinars. So I'm going to sign off for today. Happy brewing, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. I'm going to be on vacation next week. Cheers.